John Wayne Gacy. You might know him from his nasty and gruesome crimes in the 70s. He's also known as the Clown Killer because he killed at least 33 young men, frequently dressing up as a clown for children's parties. Somehow this bulbous-lipped maniac was good at increasing his trustability to others, and he had built up a solid reputation in his community. However, just like every serial killer in history that's been caught, he had some dumb slip-ups that led the police to his crime. And the justice system and cops had dumb slip-ups themselves, which cost the lives of the public they supposedly care about.
In this documentary, we're going to give constructive criticism on the things John Wayne Gacy and the cops could have done better.
How did John Wayne Gacy end up as the Clown Killer? And who would ever trust a clown in the first place? I mean, a normal person would not become a serial killer without having a messed up childhood, right? Well, in the case of Gacy, he was born on March 17, 1942, in an abusive household in Chicago, Illinois. His father was an alcoholic and would routinely beat him and his siblings up for no reason. You know, the typical portrayal of a man/father according to the Lifetime channel. Even though he was both physically and verbally abused by his father, he still wanted to look good in his eyes. He also had a hard time in school because he had a heart condition which made him bad at sports. Gacy struggled with his sexuality, realizing he was attracted to men. Gacy would later drop out after attending 4 different high schools. He would start his career in politics at the age of 18, working as an assistant precinct captain for a Democratic Party candidate. However, he left for Vegas after feeling totally sick and drained because of his controlling father. In Las Vegas, he applied for a job within the ambulance service, but was transferred to become an attendant at Palm Mortuary. The reasoning behind his transfer, he lied about how old he was, as the minimum age for an ambulance driver was 21.
So right off the bat, we can tell this guy sucks at lying and covering his tracks. I always tell my serial killers, you gotta lie better, dude. Practice when the stakes are low and get good at it. Honesty is the worst policy.
They showed him how the bodies were cleaned and embalmed. At night, he would go to the bodies and he would talk and undress them. He also confessed to embracing and caressing them until he experienced a sense of shock. Then he called his family and went home to Chicago afterwards.
You mean a murderer in Chicago? I was shocked to hear it. Some people say that at this point his family could have sent him to therapy, but I don't think psychiatrists can fix this type of crazy. Have you noticed that like half of psychiatrists are weirder than their patients and the other half are just drug salesmen?
Returning to Illinois, he graduated at Northwestern Business College in 1963 and took a management trainee position with the Nunn Bush Shoe Company. He met his first wife in Springfield, Illinois the following year in 1964. He was a fast food restaurant manager and he often made sexual advances with his employees. He also joined an organization called the JCs. And on August 1967, he sexually assaulted the 16-year-old son of a fellow JC, Donald Voorhees. He gave Donald alcohol and persuaded him to engage in mutual oral sex. Unfortunately for Gacy, the boy reported this to his father. He was at this time found out that he had been assaulting other boys too, including a fry cook he employed, by doing various things like handcuffing them to a bed, raping and threatening them with knives. Gacy pleaded guilty and got a 10-year sentence, but got out on parole after 18 months. I wonder if this would have been the case if his victims were female. And don't you think if you let someone out on parole and innocent people die because of that, you should be held accountable for those murders too? Maybe if there were consequences for letting weirdos out early, the parole board would take their decision-making process more seriously. In the second half of Gacy's career, he was performing as a clown while also having a construction company. He usually lured guys in their mid-teens to early 20s by promising them jobs at his company. He would also offer them a drink or some drugs so that he could take them into his house. His modus operandi was to give them a drink or drugs, then introduce them to a pair of handcuffs to show them a magic trick. And after all, he was a clown. Then he would cuff his own hands behind his back. Then he would release himself using keys that he hid between his fingers. He would then offer to show his victim how to do the magic trick and get them to put the handcuffs on themselves. The victim would now be restrained and Gacy could do anything he wanted to his captive.
I don't know how his victims fell for this. Even at 15, I don't think I'd be gullible enough to let some fat-lipped weirdo handcuff me for any reason, much less in my mid-20s. I always thought convincing somebody into handcuffs would be impossible until I got older and realized that if you even mention handcuffs around the right type of girls, their eyes light up. And thank God for their sake I'm not some serial killer. But it just goes to show you how trusting some people can be when they really shouldn't be.
He was investigated after the disappearance of a 15-year-old named Robert Peast. Peast had a conversation with his mother, saying that he had an opportunity to work at Gacy's construction company. Gacy killed Peast that same day. But this victim would be his last, so the police got a search warrant based on the fact that Peast went missing and was last seen at a pharmacy the same day Gacy was seen there. Plus the fact that Peast told people he was going to see Gacy for a job, and the most obvious one being that he was convicted for butt raping boys before. Like, it doesn't get more obvious than that, so the cops got a search warrant for Gacy's place. When they searched his house, they found pornography, weird books titled Pretty Boys Must Die, and driver's licenses of other missing boys, a high school ring that belonged to a 19-year-old guy, John Schick, who was also missing. Then they found out 2 of John's employees were missing as well, but they didn't arrest him, claiming this was not enough evidence. So instead they decided to follow him around to see what he was up to.
So I'm not a lawyer or detective, but you're telling me this isn't enough evidence to arrest the guy? Like, is there ever a legitimate reason to have the licenses and rings of missing people at your house when you're a convicted rapist? And why was Gacy so sloppy? He was just sprinkling evidence all over his house and never considered they might search his place. You never shit where you eat. If your employees and people linked to your business are going missing and you know you have a record, why would you select them as your victims? If the cops had a hard time putting him under arrest with this much evidence, they would have never caught him if he was preying on random townies.
So after all this, they started investigating Gacy instead of just shooting him dead in the street. For this investigation, they were following him, which, sounds pretty smart, but the detectives had the big brain idea of letting Gacy know that they were following him. If you want to catch someone doing something fishy, you don't tip them off you're following them so they can put on an act.
He tried to be cordial with us. In fact, he initiated conversations with us.
After all this, they got another warrant, because I guess during the first one they didn't totally ransack his place looking for more clues. After they found all the missing people's paraphernalia, what they found out was that Gacy was telling the boys he had a sewage issue in his crawl space, and that he needed them to do some digging down there, and that would help fix the problem.
Means A, that Gacy was Tom Sawyering these kids into digging their own graves for him, and B, that he was hiding the bodies in his own house. If he ditched the bodies anywhere else, he would have been able to stay free for a lot longer, and maybe not even got caught at all. Since being a convicted sex offender suspiciously linked to missing people is totally kosher in some places. He even told cops at this time, clowns can get away with murder.
And the cops were so nice that they let Gacy know ahead of time that they were going to get a second search warrant. Why didn't they just help him hide the bodies at that point too? I wish the cops in my town were so nice and helpful.
And we were feeding Gacy information that there's possibly looking to execute a second search warrant. He became more and more desperate.
So after Gacy got the info about the second warrant, he went to get some lawyers, and the detectives followed him to the lawyer's office, and something I didn't expect happened. The lawyers flagged down the cops and told him that Gacy confessed to some of the murders. Even though I thought lawyers were supposed to protect you even if they know you're guilty, I'm glad they didn't. At least someone in the story has some common sense to be like, I don't care what the rules are, we gotta do something about this weirdo. Gacy somehow makes it out of there before the cops could stop him, and decides to stop at a gas station because he had bags of weed on him that he wanted to get rid of, so he just dumps his weed off to the cashier. And after Gacy left the gas station, the cops stopped in and found the weed, and now they had something concrete to arrest him for.
If you have dead people in your crawl space, don't you think bags of weed would be the least of your concern when it comes to a search warrant? Maybe that's the reason none of his actions seem to have a long-term coherent plan. Maybe he was just high all the time and happened to like killing people, but wasn't sober enough or was just too lazy to do the cleanup work that goes along with murder. It's kind of like cooking. I like to cook, but nobody likes dishes. Gacy was the same way. He liked to murder, but hated disposing the bodies, so he just chucked him in his crawl space.
After he was in custody for the marijuana, they followed through on the second search warrant for his home. He was so lazy about it, he didn't even bury him that deep. It only took investigators one shovelful to discover there were bodies down in his crawl space. He was eventually tried for his crimes, but his defense was mostly about his mental state. He claimed that he was insane and that the murders were committed by an alternate personality. However, this didn't work and he was still found guilty for committing 33 murders. John Wayne Gacy was executed on May 10, 1994 after being sentenced to death by lethal injection. His last words were, "Kiss my ass."